Friend, enemy, or frenemy? How do Indians view the rise of China and its implications for India's rise? Join the conversation on this important topic by taking the China Challenge survey. The survey has been put together by researchers at the Takshashila Institution. Answer our 10 simple questions and let your voice be heard in shaping India's policy towards China. For more details, log on to www.takshashila.org.in or you can click on the link and take the survey in the show notes. Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
All right, welcome to yet another episode of All Things Policy. And today we're going to talk to Radhika Golkar. And the thing that we're going to dwell into is a lot to do with the education system and the language at the core of it. So Radhika is with British Council and she's the head of academic English programs in India. Welcome to this All Things Policy podcast, Radhika.
Thank you, Soumya. It's great to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
All right. So while we kind of go into the nuts and bolts of what we're going to chat about, largely in the context again on the language side of the Samaj Saka Bazaar influence that it's got. And we're going to take a lot from the kind of deep research Radhika has been involved in the segments of education and the intersection of language around it. So just to begin with, right, for us, when we think about, if somebody told me, just think about language, at least in my head, it's such a medium which allows you to do so much. And it kinds of taps into the potential of people because that's a way of expression.
Sure.
And you hear a lot of people saying that, hey, I think in this particular language because this is my mother tongue. And a lot of times people say, I can only think in English. So you see all shades of it, right? And just to probably think a little more from the 80s, if I had to go back, and the way we made choice of schools was predominantly one, proximity wise, it should be walkable, or rather you just cycle to school. But the next important thing that most parents kind of opted in for was, is this going to be an English medium school? And a lot of aspirations got tied to it, right? In terms of saying that if you're in a convent school, maybe your English is further better because your ability to have clarity of thought and your construction of sentences, your grammar and all of that is sorted. So at least in my head, when I think about language, it's to do with a lot of literature, poetry, aspirations. In fact, for a lot of them, it's also about having a good job in hand, right? And this seems to be one of the things that will pave the way to get it. So, Radhika, let's just hear from you more in terms of how the society responds to something like this.
Right, Soumya. I think you have a very complex question, very important but complex questions, and there's so many themes it's touching upon, right? I think to begin with, I would like to go to the first part of your question where you talk about how we all say that we think in a particular language and maybe we have expertise or fluency in others. And essentially what it's indicating that we all are multilingual. I think it's a very good, very important thing to establish that even in our daily lives, we not only think in different languages, but also many a times if you closely see how you produce language, you will also find yourself mixing languages. So just to set some context from an India perspective, we have, a recent newspaper report indicated that we have more than 19,000 active languages in India, including mother tongues and dialects. We have, of course, 22 scheduled languages, which are included in the 8th schedule of the Constitution. But we also have 100 non-scheduled languages with at least 10,000 speakers each. What's more interesting is 92 out of the 96 non-scheduled languages are tribal languages, which means it's very likely that they exist in oral forms more. We need to find that out. Why I think this sort of context is important is that, coming back to what you were saying, it's we are living in a almost hyper multilingual context where we are interacting in many languages at one time, but we are also exposed, if not interacting, we're exposed to many languages at any given point in time. So I think that context is very important. And then seeing education in that context is further complex. Um, Coming back to the aspirations bit of what you said about how we used to choose schools and how English was important, I think it continues to be important in today's communities, and especially for parents. You will see that we'll come to whether this is good or bad, but there is an increasing number of low cost private schools of having a very strong offering of an English medium instruction education for students, and which is very attractive to parents. I will come to how that could be problematic. But again, aspirations are very much there in the community. There are parental aspirations. In fact, a recent British Council report called the Future of English report, which sort of was a consultative report. We had several roundtables globally, including in India, with policymakers and members of the community, indicated that in India, it continues to be a very, very strong need. There is a very strong need for English. It is connected to employment opportunities, as you rightly pointed out. And it also gives rise to the low cost private schooling that I mentioned earlier. I think some questions that we probably need to think of, and coming to your Samaj perspective, Soumya, is also questions like, is English medium instruction important to achieve that goal? Or, for example, how much English do you need to succeed in your job, depending on what career paths you choose? I think those questions become important to think about because they have a very clear link to what happens in early education, in early years in schools, and how foundations are set for millions of learners in this country. How what happens in those years matters because that either makes it or breaks it for them for their future years of education. So I think I'm happy to delve into those questions as we go along, but I think I wanted to identify the problem there and the context first, like how multilingual we are, how there is a need of English, and what is the real need at least early years of education. How can we marry all those expectations as well, right? That's important as well.
Surely. So, if we extend this conversation further, so if you look at math, right, there
Hmm.
is this thing about, oh, you say a child is, say, in the third grade or the fourth grade in the primary school level, and is unable to kind of do basic mathematics, right? And similarly, have you seen this deficit of language per se being measured in a way that gives a little bit of an insight on what the next steps could look like? Because I think each state has tried different things, right? Like,
Hmm.
you at some point, some states made it mandatory, then it kinds of
Yeah.
loosened up and said, oh, we can look at it as a third language kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I think the spirit of the language should be such that locally a lot of people, like for example in Karnataka, a lot of people I know within the Bangalore community make a genuine effort to also at least pick up conversational Kannada, right? And the kind of ways they do it is, sometimes there's a quick crash course that allows you to go with small phrases, right? You can have a conversation with somebody who's driving the rickshaw, or at times it could be the help at home, or sometimes it could be just to have a nice gesture with somebody passing by and who's your neighbor. So that should be the spirit of language, of
Hmm.
course, in terms of ensuring that we are not, losing out on languages completely. Because
Right.
also the trend currently is maybe only grandparents are the people whom, the grandchildren engage with in local languages, and pretty much otherwise, because people are married across communities, so there are more than two languages in a household being spoken, so then you take that middle ground, right? So if you can kind of give us a sense of how deep is this, and
Hmm.
what it looks like.
Absolutely. I think to begin with, the examples that you are referring to where We are trying to connect with our own languages in many ways, at least in the spoken forms or some forms, trying to get them back into our daily discourse. I think that effort everyone is taking. And I think that's where I really find the national education policy in line with this, because traditionally education policies in India have asserted and sort of brought into focus the importance of regional languages, mother tongues in the teaching learning process in, as part of education through various formulations of the three language policy. But what is different about the National Education Policy 2020 is that it again sort of brings the three language policy, center stages it very well, gives a very clear indication of what those three languages could be for states. Because I think, and going back to the point I made about how multilingual this country is, it also indicates that the hyper local reality is unique. It is not possible to sort of scale up one standard approach of multilingual education everywhere. And that's where the policy gives that suggestion and guidance to states to see which languages you want to include in that teaching learning process at the school level. I think the only suggestion is that two of those languages are Indian languages, and the third language could be what the state chooses. So I think, going back to your question, I think this reviving of one's own language and having the access to education in one's own language, either your mother tongue, either your familiar language, or a local language, or a regional language, is, I think, very crucial. And the policy sort of highlights that in, I feel, in a very strong way. Just to give you a global perspective, why that's important again is the United Nations has put out data about 40% of the population globally doesn't have access to education in their own language or a familiar language, which is huge. And there is a very clear link to the declining foundational literacy and numeracy skills in students as well. So, about your question about whether we have tested English skills at early levels, just to come to that in a bit, the State of Global Learning Poverty update of 2022 indicated that around 70% of children globally cannot understand a simple text by the age of 10, right? So, and coming to India then, the annual status of education report, the ASER report that is so useful, indicates exactly that for India. The 2008, I think the latest, the 2018 one, indicates there's a steep decline in foundation literacy and numeracy skills. And why I'm stating these data points is because it has a very strong connection to the language of education in India. And that's where I think the policy is in the right direction. The national curriculum framework for education also gives further guidance and further support to implement this three language policy by identifying curricular goals for the schools and teachers. So in a way, I think we've made a lot of progress in a concrete way on the policy front. Coming back to testing of English, have we tested students' English at school levels? Have we found gaps? I think British Council's own global stand on this has been that in low and middle income countries, we don't encourage teaching in English at the early years, at least. So the medium of instruction recommended is the child's local language or a familiar language or a regional language, any language that the child sort of plays with. If that is included in education, that is what we recommend. And how we look at English is really as part of the wider multilingual landscape in India. So English is one of the languages that you need probably to succeed in your career pathways and have more opportunities. But in early years, it could be treated as a subject. So I'm going back to our earlier conversation, Soumya, about how much do we need English in that age in school in early years. What we're recommending is English could be looked at as a subject and gradually introduced orally first, but the primary medium of instruction should be the child's own familiar, own language, mother tongue or a familiar language. So the short answer is, we haven't done that kind of testing simply because we don't encourage English medium instruction in that age group.
Okay. But how has it been, working alongside with teachers to kind of
Yeah.
develop capabilities, or, what's the approach that you take to kind of get them up to speed?
Right. So I think one important thing we've realized, I mean, we have done several partnerships with state governments over the past 12 years, almost worked with 12 state governments to work with teachers at medium and large scale. So we've had to engage with teacher development models that work at that scale. For example, in Maharashtra, the largest group we've sort of worked with is 60,000 primary school teachers, right? So,
Mm.
keeping aside multilingual education, what we've also learned about teacher education generally is that, and again, there is a lot of research about that teacher education works best when you're talking about the issues from the teacher's daily life in the classroom. If you're able to answer what the teacher can take away immediately to their classrooms from a training program or a session they attend or from a webinar they attend, I think that's where the success of that intervention lies for the teacher. What am I taking back? What are the three things I'm taking back to my classroom to address my challenges in the classroom? That's the sort of general learning we've had about teacher development. What How that has informed our approach to teacher development is community led. I think what we've learned is that if you create spaces for teachers where they can come together and discuss their challenges and share expertise, that is a very good starting point for their teacher professional development. And I'm giving this background because this again has a very strong implication on how do you then support teachers who are teaching multilingual classrooms, right? Because if you look at scenarios in India, there are many cases, and this is not limited to urban or rural or any of those combinations and permutation and combinations. It's pretty much every classroom in India is multilingual. In any given scenario, you might see that the teacher doesn't speak the language that the majority of the children speak. It's likely that both the teacher and the students don't speak the school language, and it's possible that the students are interacting in a language in a school which is different from the home language that they come from. So there are these multiple scenarios, and teachers are expected to deal with these scenarios, address these challenges, and make sure that learning outcomes are met for students. Coming back to how we can support teachers there, one of the big research projects that we undertook, British Council was a key partner, in fact, in a project called Multilingualism and Multiliteracy Project, which looked at multilingual learners' school abilities and cognitive skills in English medium instruction versus regional medium instruction schools. So we looked at standards fourth and fifth in Delhi, Bihar, and Hyderabad. What we found out, of course, was that students who were learning in their own language, in a familiar language, were doing better with these skills. But coming to teacher development, what we also found out that teachers were mixing languages in both scenarios. Even if they were teaching in a regional language that they knew, they were still mixing more than one language. Sometimes it was two local languages. Sometimes it was English and a regional language. And even in an English medium instruction school, that was happening. So what we're learning from this is that teachers, just like you and I, mix languages on a daily basis. That reflects in a classroom in India as well. Teachers are mixing languages and making the most of the linguistic repertoire they have and their students have to make meaning in the classroom. And I feel that that is where part of the solution is to look at existing teacher practices. What are they getting right day in, day out, in their classrooms? What are they innovating with? What are they learning from their own experiences with students? And that's why I'll go back to my comment on how it can be community driven. I think
Mm.
one teacher professional development model that has worked significantly well for scales in India is a community of practice approach, where
Mm.
teachers meet at a regular time decided by them at cluster levels near their schools. They have an agenda to follow. They learn from each other. They share their challenges. They create a safe space, and they own that community. They own their development. We did that in Maharashtra for over 40,000 teachers, and worked really well. In fact, We also expanded on that project. We did a review of 6 international projects where a community of practice model was implemented globally in the form of teacher activity groups, where just what I described, where teachers meet at a cluster level and own that meeting and own that discussion completely. What we found out was, for teachers who were teaching English, they also found a lot of help in those meetings to learn English themselves, because that is a big gap. In many situations, teachers' own English could be inadequate to teach English in the classroom. And then if you put English in a multilingual scenario, it's all the more complex. But the teachers also reported a very positive preference for such meetings. And the prime reason being that it's not an expert led top down meeting, it's a space for them to discuss their issues and their challenges, share their successes, even. And if you take this to a multilingual educational context, I think there is a very strong need for teachers to come together to share what they're getting right in such complex situations. There is a need to sometimes even legitimize these practices, because a lot of us, in fact, have questions about mixing languages. Academically speaking,
Yeah.
then which language are you going to be better at? And parents have reservations about teachers mixing languages. It's sometimes indicative of lack of proficiency or lack of expertise. But the truth of the matter is that language mixing is a sort of an essential feature of any multilingual culture or a society. And I think we could legitimize some of these practices in the classroom. With this background, Soumya, where I wanted to go with, it's a long journey there, but where I wanted to go to was, at the British Council, we are currently building on the multilingualism and multiliteracy project that I talked about, where we found that students learn better in their own language. And we're building on it, and to investigate what these teacher practices look like. What kind of support do they need in the classroom? How can these intuitive practices that teachers are already implementing in the classroom, how can we build research from it? How can research be informed by them? But also, how can these practices be more structured, more pedagogically thought out, more measured, and more examined, I would say, so that we are able to capitalize on those micro innovations that teachers are doing. So, one part of it is continuing research in that area. It's called Multilingual Education, Teaching, Learning, and Assessment Project, which is in partnership with the University of Cambridge and the English and Foreign Languages University in Hyderabad, which is ongoing, and I'm happy to keep you posted with the results. But the other bit, just one more bit that I would like to add, is we're also encouraging a lot of teacher action research from ground up level. So we're running a scheme where we are funding institutions in India to build up these mentoring schemes where we train teachers to examine their daily problems in the classroom. So it's more like daily teacher action research. It may not be the academic format of the research, but it helps teachers to be more in tune with the problems they're facing. How do they measure these problems? How do they find solutions to these problems? How do they talk to each other and find solutions as well? So that's the other part of the work that we're doing to support teachers in these contexts.
It's interesting. So, just reflecting back, I've been in the HR profession for the longest, and my stint in the corporate career was such that a lot of profiles that used to come, have this language element, right?
Right.
And people take pride in saying, okay, I know international languages.
Mm,
They say I'm proficient in French, but I have fluency in Spanish. And at least then it was mostly German and French that in the 80s that people preferred. But now you will meet a lot of youngsters who are looking at, say, Mandarin and Spanish and all as subjects that they pick up in, school as well. So I think people want to kind of flex around the language proficiency they have. So that's
yeah.
why sometimes people say, I can write as well, right? Writing in Mandarin is another skill altogether. But
Mm,
again, tech has enabled itself in a way that, we are able to use technology, one, to create, say, audiobooks kind of
right.
concept, right? Where people know conversational language, but they can't write, but they know the comprehension side is there. So I think the tech has kind of also carved out a path in a way that people can access different tech-enabled systems to either translate it, or even kind of, like I said, consume content in a way, or even improve a language, right? I mean, a lot of people go through basic courses so that when you're reaching another country, you kind of know at least some language which is good enough to kind of impress upon the other side to say, hey, I made an effort to learn your language, right? And that itself is a nice gesture to show around that I care about it, right? You win the other side in a way, like when you know that local language of just saying a hello or whatever that conversation
Yeah,
starter would look like. I think that sets the context for a larger thing. So I feel tech is only going to improve this atmosphere further. Like, you can, like the Basha platform and all of that,
absolutely.
you're looking at content moving across different languages and not feeling less, like even things that are available on the OTT platform now are available across languages, right? So that makes it
Absolutely.
more relatable for people. And I think we still go on to the thing that you enjoy seeing the movie in its original language, right? And
True.
still use subtitles. And I think people also at times find it difficult, like somebody looking at anime and all that. I know that a lot of parents are with the grouse that the subtitles are very compromised language that is used, like it's not direct, interesting, or grammatically okay sentences at times, right? They feel like the language is getting like fixed in the child's mind in a very dysfunctional way. So
Mhm.
there are many layers to what tech and AI can do for this, right, Radhika?
Absolutely.
So maybe we should talk about that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think when it comes to technology, I think I'm just also referring to an earlier conversation we had. I think we are living in times when there will always be a solution in tech, especially for education. There's so much opportunity. You rightly pointed out that, I mean, coming back to a multilingual education context, translations can be done. Teachers who don't speak the child's language can seek so much help from AI powered tools. Teachers can
Yeah.
improve their own language skills through AI, and students can also improve their own language skills through these tools. In fact, we recently published a research report on artificial intelligence and English language teaching. So, of course, this is limited to English language teaching, but this was a global research where we reached out to teachers from 118 countries, including India. And what we found out was teachers were already using many AI powered tools to teach English, but also to improve for their own professional development, sometimes to improve their own language skills. So it could be sometimes, in some cases, if your own language skills are not up to mark, you may want to use AI powered tools to show a model of how something is said. And all those things are used by teachers, even in India. So that's good news. But what the report also threw up was that teachers need help, or need a lot of training in artificial intelligence, in terms of literacy, the AI literacy part of it, where
Hmm.
if teachers could, and I think it's true for all of us, but particularly when you're in a situation where when you're addressing a lesson, putting together a lesson plan or going into the classroom and you don't know what the students are going to throw up, I think you need some quick orientation. You need to understand how you can leverage artificial intelligence to the best abilities. Many teachers, for example, were using AI to create lesson plans for their classrooms. We're yet to see how successful these lesson plans are, but the good news is that teachers are already using it. But also coming back to the point on AI literacy, while technology will always have a solution, I think we probably need to make some conscious efforts to see how these solutions can be truly scalable for those scales we are looking at in India, right? How can these solutions really reach those contexts where they are most needed sometimes? So that, I think, it's evolving. It's an ever evolving scenario. So I'm very hopeful about that. On the other side of the spectrum, Soumya, also is the minimal technology approach, right? So if you look at the National Council of Education Research and Training, the NCRT,
Hmm.
recently published 52 primers in the 52 non-scheduled, including the scheduled and non-scheduled languages. And this was with the view to help teachers and learners with basics of those languages. So if you look at the spectrum, they also have this flippable books online, which is like minimal technology, but it's also scalable. There's so much opportunity on this wide spectrum of technology, I feel. There's so much to do. I agree.
Interesting, but I'm glad that at least during the COVID phase,
Yes.
a lot of people started, acknowledging that digital ways are the
Absolutely.
ways to kind of move ahead, right? I even the Story Weaver kind of a platform, which is to publish stories, and
Mm.
you can kind of plug and play a lot of things, which is very user intuitive as well, right? And the whole user experience of creating something like that, because if you had to go through a publishing house and get something out, it's quite a tedious one. So there are platforms, and even the Pratham Books kind of an initiative where on the spine of the book you actually know if the you're in the quadrant one,
Yes,
two,
that's
three,
a
or
beautiful.
four, which allows you to say if a child is trained to pick in this category, then the child can read by themselves, or in some cases you've got to read, and then there is a level of proficiency, means your words become a little more complex. And this is across languages, right? Like there are books which have like the local language, and then there is English on this side, so you know how to kind of map them. And those are initiatives, I think, that are truly kind of
Absolutely.
helping people move on the reading habits and also appreciate language and the illustration also. For a lot of young children, it's about what illustration says, right? I mean, there's so much of joy in just seeing those things coming alive in a way and visualizing it in a way, right? So
Absolutely.
a language allows one to do much beyond what we kind of possibly see as obvious, right? That's
Absolutely.
also,
You make a very interesting point about so much being already out there, right? There's so much of technology that's already been leveraged for languages specifically. And I feel like from what you're saying, there needs to be sort of a consolidation of how these can, and maybe I don't know, but I'm sure that these are used at scale as well. I'm sure they are in some way. And if these stories and if these great tools are somehow brought into a daily classroom, I think that will be great as well. I think that will take the conversation forward.
yeah, yeah. Interesting. And Radhika, you being our alum, and there's
Yes.
another person, Vasant Shetty, I was talking to you
Yes.
about, in
Yes.
fact,
Yes.
the MyLang Books thing, right? So his effort was to kind of create a platform for languages to convert into audiobooks. And now a lot of people who are settled in different parts of the globe are able to kind of consume the literature version in an audio book format. So I think there are many layers or multitudes to this language kind of a conversation, but I think people always grapple with these things, right? Especially when it means that it's part of the education system. Otherwise there's a flavor of niceness when people have on-site opportunities. They are so looking forward to pick up the language,
Yeah.
maybe if they're going to
Yeah.
Paris and they're going to be stationed in France, or they're going to be in Spain and stuff like that. People look forward to it. I would love to see a time when even children are looking forward to languages, not thinking about it in the context of saying it's thrusted upon me to learn, but learn
Mm,
because
mm.
it's so much to enjoy, right? I mean, the literature, even Urdu for that matter, it's so nice to listen when people share about it, even the writing part of it, right? So I think as long as we are able to appreciate these textures of language, we will go much beyond the conversation of seeing, oh, how to make things mandatory and be very rigid about
Absolutely.
it.
Absolutely. And also, Soumya, I also remember a point you made earlier about how you see young people wanting to learn more languages and they have a certain amount of fluency in learning new languages as well, right? Even, I mean, not just young people, but many, when they enter the job markets and when they start looking for jobs, they feel like the languages are going to add an additional layer of uh, skills to their profiles.
Yes.
Very interesting. There's a lot of research also indicating that if you learn in a language you know in your early years, you're likely to learn other languages quicker and better as you proceed. And I think that is also a very strong feature of multilingual cultures and people, that we are able to capitalize on that skill of learning multiple languages sometimes at the same time. So I'm with you completely. And going back to your point on technology, I think it's point on, there is so much out there. I feel there is a strong need to bring all of it together and see what can we do to support classrooms that need the help most. I'm sure that there is something happening maybe I'm unaware of. But yeah.
No, I mean, there are, of course, many unknowns, and I think we will stumble upon it in
True.
everything that, we discussed, talked well upon. But thanks, Radhika, for being on this conversation. And I think we've been able to kind of look at it in the context of the society, the role of the government, and of course, how the markets are playing this out. And it's become a lot more accessible in a way. And we being on the global map,
Yeah.
India has ensured that people, of course, got jobs, and I think people across the globe know that Indians have an advantage with the language, right? And we also related to, like, people say you need to learn maybe music and instruments
Mm,
and languages to keep your
mm,
cognition steady and running. I think we will find some sort of a middle ground, and there's always this tug of war about things
true.
in the environment that we live in, so which is inevitable. But the fact that we are having a conversation, and if we care about it, and in the promise of seeing language to be a medium not just for communication, but to appreciate, learn, unlearn some of those things, right? And languages always give you that element of curiosity. You stumble upon a new word, and then you're like, oh, what does this mean? And then what's an equivalent word, right?
Yes.
Especially with translation and all, you will never get sometimes that right appropriate word, and you're like, actually this is a synonym to this that I'm trying to explain,
True.
but it doesn't sound right? There are a lot of things that sound right as well. So I'm glad that we are thinking about ensuring the teacher community, the whole education system ramps up to a way that it's more in the context of saying the spirit of local language will exist, but it's also in the global
Yeah,
environment. How do we ensure that we have an advantage of sorts?
absolutely.
All right. Thanks, Radhika, once again. And look forward to do another episode whenever things progress in this context.
Thank
And
you.
wonderful having you here.
Thank you, Soumya. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.